Welcome to the Mountain Stories, Mountain Futures podcast. The aim of the podcast is to bring to light new stories, new perspectives on mountain landscapes and mountain communities around the world with the help of a wide range of expert guests. We're going to be showcasing exciting new academic research on mountain history and some amazing work by creative practitioners engaging with mountain landscapes in a range of different media. I'm Jason König from the University of St Andrews.
And I'm Jonathan Pitches from the University of Leeds. What a great pleasure it is to welcome you, Simone Kenyon, to our podcast. Simone is a practice researcher, performer, artist and producer born in Bradford, West Yorkshire, but now permanently based in Scotland, who has a special commitment to producing work in Scotland. I will be focusing on that for most of our conversation. She has so much to say about mountains, but perhaps most relevant to us today is as the choreographer and artistic creator of the place-sensitive performance piece Into the Mountain, inspired and informed by that lyrical and embodied prose classic Nan Shepherd's The Living Mountain. Building on 6 years of preparatory work Into the Mountain drew on the input of nearly 100 women, many of whom reside in the Cairngorm area, and merged guided walking practices with choreography and a 22-piece choir singing a newly composed piece. The practice formed part of a recently completed PhD thesis which explored how feminist collaborative methodologies can make a unique contribution to mountain culture. Welcome, Simone. It's so great to have you on this podcast, and thanks for taking the time to talk to us. Jason and I have been excitedly discussing your work over the past few months, so how rewarding it is now to have the opportunity to talk with you directly today. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Jonathan and Jason. It's really nice to be here.
Could we start by going before any of this and perhaps you talking a little bit about how you came to work in mountains, going as far back as your childhood if necessary? What is it that switched you on as a practitioner researcher about mountain landscapes?
Well, I don't come from a kind of mountain environment, but I did live on the tops of the hill of the hills in Bradford. So I don't have that history of family who mountaineered. I didn't go out camping, and in some ways that's probably the motivation of my curiosity and where it's led me sort of as I went into my teenage and into my 20s. So I'm really not from a mountaineering background, I would say. But what I did have was a lot of amazing views of the moors around Yorkshire from where I live. And also, that place is a council estate. It wasn't a rural farm with an amazing view, but in these council estates that were built in the 60s or 50s in Bradford, they were pushed out to the edges of the city. And, the payoff was that you had these incredible views. So I grew up with having these wider perspectives as part of my sort of embodied psychology in a way. So I think that did quite sort of lay the landscape of a need to be able to sort of have a wider sense of the world. So I guess it was a gradual process, like my interest in walking. There were some necessities around that. You had to walk as a teenager into town and back again, or to get the bus. And we walked a lot around the farm countryside that was close by as a way of just escaping where we lived. So I think there's something about that element of venturing out beyond the familiar that was really ingrained in me. I also think as a teenager, I went through a grieving process of a family member, and walking really was my place to grieve. And I just instinctively walked for long periods over a number of years. So I think those kinds of groundings really set something up where the feeling of walking and what it does, the act of walking, the sense of coming to your senses and a groundedness with any kind of emotional landscapes that I'd experienced in the past was really sort of a fundamental learning, I think. And then when I went to university, I met all these other people who went out walking and wore like proper gear to stop themselves from getting wet. And so friends introduced me to mountains and good friends. So it was a gradual process of going to the Peak District, going to the Lake District, working at YHAs in summer times as jobs to get to these places as well was also a way of accessing places like the Lake District that just felt quite impossible for me to engage with at the time. So even just, that kind of work experience allowed me to have 2 shifts one in the morning and one in the day, and then be able to run up Yew Barrow in the Lake District and back, or swim in Westwater and things. So yeah, really trying to find ways to engage with mountains, and it just felt like quite a gradual, instinctual searching, if you like. I think working in the Lake District was quite a big shift for me as well, in terms of my desire to be in the mountains a bit more.
You talked a little bit there about an embodied understanding of landscape, and obviously as a choreographer, you're an expert in embodiment in many ways. Can you say a little bit maybe about the relationship between your professional practice as a choreographer and that idea of embodiment and landscape?
Yeah, sure. So I went to Nottingham Trent University to do my undergraduate, and I've trained in visual arts before I went to university, and did an interdisciplinary degree and explored my sort of interdisciplinary practice between visual arts and also new dance choreography, it was called, so the kind of looking at 1980s sort of postmodern ways of thinking about how choreographic methods really draw in the everyday and the pedestrian movements, and somatic and embodied practices were really part of that training. So a lot of awareness through movement, a lot of like moving and improvising, responding. It really came out of that training, I would say. But obviously as well, just how you sort of relate to places. And, in my teenage years, hung around with lots of skateboarders, sitting in cafes, talking to different people who were in those kind of skating environments and city environments. So it was kind of like how you engage and relate to not just movement and embodiment, but also people and the place. And it made sense for me that this way of feeling through engagement with people and place was really part of that training.
And what was it then that took you from the Lake District and from the moors of Yorkshire up to Scotland?
Well, I'd been working on various outdoor walking arts projects, from a long time, or a good 10 to 15 years since I moved to Scotland. So it was really an interest in moving more into these environments that I was drawn to, if you want to talk about it in these kind of romantic ways. But yeah, I guess I'd been making work around walking arts contexts for quite a number of years. And I'd been working in the northeast of Scotland with an organisation called Devon Art, and really spending each season coming back and trying to figure out a long distance walking route whilst working on a residency there. And just kept falling more and more in love with the sort of landscape and the environments, and then eventually just decided that we should move to Scotland and be much closer to that place, because I guess the curiosity was leading me and the learning was leading me, and that was a motivation to move to Scotland, really.
I'm sure Jason will pick up on some of the granular detail around the relationship between Scottish mountains, the Cairngorms, and your own piece. But before we get there, Simone, I wanted to talk about one of the most extraordinary enduring projects that you've undertaken, which is the Pennine Way, The Legs That Make Us, with Tamara Ashley. Could you just say a little bit about that project, how it came about, and indeed what you might have learnt back in 2006 that you took into the mountain project?
So Tamara Ashley is another dance artist and collaborator who I'd been working with for a number of years on some other projects, and we'd been working on a project, and at the end of that we'd been talking about walking, and basically came up with this idea of walking and dancing the Pennine Way. So we committed to just making that happen, and yeah, it really was a chance for us to explore what it means to think about walking as an art or an aesthetic practice, something where the walking shaped the artwork itself. And the Pennine Way route is often described as the backbone of England. And I think the anatomical image of the mountains being this central structure of the country or the land really interested us as dancers, and how we connect to that through our understandings of and our interest in the body. So we really thought about how this backbone structure also creates the baseline, potentially, if you think about it as a musical or choreographic score. A sort of the route is almost like the baseline of the score, and everything that we respond to is driven along by this physical geological score of the land itself. So we walked the Pennine Way's 270-mile route over a month, so we also slowed it down. We weren't in any hurry to try and do it in the 10 days or 2 weeks that most people do. So already that sensibility of like, how do we slow down? How do we stretch this out? How do we really listen to what's happening in this path that's been made, to the even just walking across some of the moorland on stone flags that have been placed down there from mills from Yorkshire, sort of recognizing that the history was much more nuanced, and it wasn't just about traversing a landscape, but the cultures and the kind of small details of moving through this place is really prominent in the sort of materiality of it, and also our experience of the duration of it as well, and who we were encountering and how we were encountering and relating to the place. So we spent a month, and we also commissioned 5 other artists to respond to different parts of the route. So I think that was really our response to also recognizing that we were these kind of nomadic creative collaborators moving through and being like the sort of part of that continuous rhythm, but allowing other artists to create more of a specific framework for different areas along the way. And we allowed them to choose which places they wanted to be in as well. And there was a visual artist and a performance artist and a dance maker and a writer. So there's lots of different approaches, and we did eventually make a book from all of that as well. But it was also a way of opening up that practice, which I guess really informed Into the Mountain in terms of thinking of a feminist practice and collaborative interdisciplinary methods. It was an amazing project for us that I think really set the foundation for me about thinking how dancers can contribute to walking arts as a context. I felt at the time like I was really interested in making walking art, but often felt the sort of practices that dancers were engaging with were very similar to what walking and visual artists engaging in walking arts were doing. And it's like, well, that's what we do all the time, but we don't necessarily get framed, or we're not framing our work in the same context. So for us, it was also about making more visible dancers' practices within that context as well, because we felt like it was a bit overlooked.
Fascinating. Thanks so much, Simone.
Yeah, well, it'd be great to move on now to talk a little bit about this amazing, more recent project, Into the Mountain. It's maybe worth saying for listeners that there's some fantastic material up on your website, Into the Mountain website, and it's been a great pleasure exploring that in addition to the conversations we've had. For those who are not familiar with the project, you could start just by giving a brief summary of what you're trying to do, and perhaps also tell us a little bit about how you came to conceive of the project in the first place and to start work on it.
Yeah, so Into the Mountain is really a performance project or a wider art project that explores predominantly women's experiences of the Cairngorm's mountains and mountaineering culture more generally. And the aim of the project really was to explore these themes or elements of, I guess, that were troubling me as somebody entering into that mountaineering sort of experience as well. How do we explore and ask questions, and how do we create space and visibility for us to think about how to be in mountains in different ways and different approaches? Nan Shepherd's writing, The Living Mountain, was really central to that idea. And, the title comes from her work, where she talks about walking into the mountains rather than onto the mountains. So the wider project really was a culmination of this years of research and going out into mountains and speaking to other women, but also it was a year-long programme of different activities that then culminated in this final performance that happened in the Glenfeshie area of the Cairngorms National Park.
Great. It's fascinating to see this connection with Nan Shepherd as an inspiration for the project. I just wonder whether you might be able to say a little bit more about how your own work relates to that, to the kinds of interpretations others have been making. Do you feel you're more or less in line with the way other people are reading Nan Shepherd, or are there aspects of her work that you want to bring out that you feel have maybe got lost from view in other treatments?
I'm so grateful to be able to read a new publication of this book with Robert McFarlane writing the introduction. I felt like that really set off a new wave of interest, right? And so I'd been working on a project in the northeast of Scotland in Huntly for an organisation called Devon Arts. I was working on a residency where I came each season to try and figure out this long distance walking route that cut across some of the Carbrack area there and some of these private landowners that were sort of not maintaining paths and access was getting more difficult. Yes, and so obviously I was working in the Northeast and found this book, or someone recommended the book, and I started reading it. So I wasn't in the Cairngorms, but I was on the edge of the Cairngorms, trying to understand this element of land ownership and trying to meet different people and think about how you could engage people in this particular landscape that actually a lot of tourists don't come to. It's kind of on the edge of the Cairngorms, it's a bit invisible. And so the book became quite a useful device, and she was like my collaborator. Because I'm English and I'm a visitor from that area, you know, what she did was almost became a bridge in her text as a way to articulate how I wanted to encourage people to move in the landscape or in the place. And as part of that residency and some of the other work I was doing with Devon Arts, we ran certain workshops or walkshops, as you might be called them then. And what I noticed was trying to lead these these groups in sort of more creative, embodied, sensory ways of engaging with a place. When I read out some of Nan Shepherd's text and even some of the really particular provocations that she suggests in the book, people seemed really up for doing stuff and trying things out, and they were much more, I guess, open to exploring, because I think their connection and understanding of Nan Shepherd, because of where we were in the northeast of Scotland as well, really meant that they respected her and they related to what her writing was. Whereas if I come in and say, oh, I'm a dancer, do you want to walk with your eyes closed, hold, you know, and helping your partner walk through the path, they often were just like, why are we doing this? But actually, if we talk about it in relation to Nan Shepherd's approach, they were much more open. And so it became this sort of, I would say, a kind of imaginative collaboration with Nan Shepherd's text that really opened up conversation for me, and it felt like this sort of intergenerational dialogue with an author whose writing was really giving me some answers and giving me pathways to engage with people as well on the ground. So that's kind of how it took off. And on the walks that I was doing, if you go up in the Glenbucket estate, which is further into the sort of hills from Huntly, you can on the edge of the Cairngorms National Park. So I was working with Nan Shepherd's writing in this area, and then in the sort of higher places of Glenbucket Estate, I could see the hills of the Cairngorms, especially when they were covered in snow. And I guess I felt like the book was leading me and the work was leading me closer and closer to actually being in the Cairngorms. And I remember really specifically sat on a sort of rocky outcrop in Glenbucket Estate, just looking at the hills in the Cairngorms going, why am I reading this book here? I need to be over there a bit further. And so that project really enabled me to kind of keep moving closer to actually following in the footsteps of Nan Shepherd and getting excited and curious about that place after reading the text.
Fascinating. I hadn't heard that story about the rocky outcrop before, and I completely understand that sense of a kind of calling, I guess. I wonder, Simone, whether you wouldn't mind taking us back further, because of course Into the Mountain has two parts to it, doesn't it? There's a solo part and a group part. Maybe it's true to say that the latter has had the more broadcasting around it. I know it was a feature of The Guardian. But that first Into the Mountain solo piece was at an international dance festival, wasn't it? Could you say a little bit about what you were doing there and how it might have informed some of the thinking that went into the larger piece?
Yeah, sure. So in 2017, I was an associate artist of Dance International Glasgow at the Tramway. And so as part of that, and also as part of my PhD research, I was already in this place of knowing I wanted to make a group piece. But, you know, the realities of being an artist as well is you have to make other work, I guess, to find and answer some of the questions of how to move into a larger scale project. But yeah, I made a solo performance for Dance International Glasgow Festival in 2017. And part of that, it was really exploring how I can use explore my own solo experience, because that was the resources that I had at the time, and to think about what is it, first of all, to try to bring the mountain experience into a performance studio to a seated audience where you're constructing a sort of theatrical framework more. And what comes across through the sort of embodied movement and through moving through memory of being in the Cairngorms. So I was quite curious to see if my body can imbue the sort of memories of the mountains and what that quality of movement shifts through moving with memory as well, and then how that relates to an audience experience. And obviously sort of in the territory of, I guess, constructing worlds in that sense, but it was a really helpful performance project that I can always sit in relation to now and then, and some of the learning that came from that felt like I'm trying to bring the place and the mountain place and the sense of mountain place into the studio, but it never felt quite enough. And I guess it reaffirmed the sort of motivation to make the work with the Cairngorms and with the mountains themselves. And I think there's something that different levels of collaborating and listening to mountains and how that manifests itself in sort of creative projects has really different aesthetics or really different ways of approaching it. The solo was a 30 to 40 minute piece, and I explored all the different elements of the training that I'd done. So I'd gone into sort of more, I guess, thinking about more of the winter mountaineering training that I was engaged in, and as I was getting more and more technical, sort of in that technical phase of learning more and what that movement does and how it sort of sits in your body and how you have to rehearse and practice being in the mountains, and the amount of times you have to figure out how to use an ice axe to do a safety arrest in the snow, or the movement of working with crampons felt relatively new. So it was also interested in how these technical abilities become also a rehearsal, and you going out into the mountains to practice ways of moving quite specifically. So there's also elements of that coming into the studio as well, and working with ropes and how that technical equipment also stood in for the River Dee, and working with the materiality of those technical aspects and also how they might represent and allow a sort of agency to represent something else.
And of course, you were working with other mountain trainers at that stage, mountain leaders, weren't you, doing those mountain leadership courses? And that idea of training and guiding was a fundamental part of the Into the Mountain group piece. Was that a conscious connection point that you made? And how have you managed to draw in those other elements of mountain culture into your practice around the group piece?
The mountain leadership and the mountain training has been an ongoing thing since actually the Pennine Way project. I first engaged in mountain leader training as part of the Pennine Way project with Tamara, and we both engaged in the mountain leader training in 2006. I'm definitely part of a percentage of women who do the training, then they don't do the assessment, and the different levels of drop off and engagement of women doing in mountain leadership training and beyond. So I would say that I definitely fit into that category. I've done the training twice now. The second time I did it, I was 7 months pregnant and I'm still working towards the assessment now, because I'm a parent. So hopefully I'll be doing that in May. But again, I've done numerous refresher courses. So it's, the reality of how that plays out is another point aside maybe. But I think been working with mountain leaders and involved in that sort of interested in the pedagogy of training and how that relates to dance training and how we facilitate people's experience through walking and through walking leadership. Just in the same way that I came into leading people on walks through movement and as my training as a dancer, but then continuously sort of trying to fold in this walking leadership into that and outdoor education. So I think that was there from the very start, and it's been there for a long time, how we bring and collaborate with these different specialisms, if you like. So it's always been leading some of the practice, I would say.
Simone, just to ask a little bit more about this, not sure if this is a question actually, because you've given us a lot of detail on this already, but I'm really interested in this relationship with mountaineering culture, climbing culture, partly because of what's going on in the wider field of mountain studies at the moment. There are more and more people obviously trying to move beyond conventional stories about the history of human interaction with mountains as a history of conquest, Western male elite domination of mountain summits. And that to some extent, that's one of the things we're interested in the podcast as a whole, just telling different kinds of stories about mountains. But it's really striking to me that what you're doing is a little bit different here in the sense that you're really key to your work to engage actually with mountaineering techniques, mountaineering culture, but perhaps to repurpose it rather than simply ignoring it or moving beyond it.
Yeah, I think that's always been my intention in a way is to, this. So at the beginning of some of the research on the Into the Mountain group piece, I spoke to over 50 women in the Cairngorm. So I spent a winter training, living in the Cairngorms, and I put a call out to speak to different women living in the area, but actually got quite an international response and spoke to a woman who was in her 80s living in Canada to younger, really active in the community in the Cairngorm. So there's a real breadth of women I spoke to about their experiences of and their relationship to the Cairngorms. And that included also professionals and mountain leaders like Heather Morning, whose then relationship, our continued conversations meant that she was then, really part of the process of making this work and was instrumental in the sort of safety aspects of it and mountain leadership. But what came out of those discussions with all these individuals was that this sense of feeling of belonging or not belonging or not quite being committed enough to mountaineering in the way that the culture kind of sets it up. And I think that's also what I was feeling, this feeling of how do you belong if, I think this is where it goes back to this thing of the lineage, your lineage of how you came to mountains. And I often heard a lot of people say, oh, I was brought up with mountains, I've lived in mountains, or my parents, so brought me into it. I was camping all the time. There's a kind of justification of like, I have earned this and I belong here, whereas I didn't have any of that as a young person. So it's that thing of from the very get-go, you can feel excluded. And that's before you even enter into all the other details of that potentially on a sort of cultural level. So I think that's what I was pushing up and trying to stay with the trouble of that, and to go into it and not like with my mountain leader training in 2006, you're your own worst enemy sometimes when you can convince yourself that you don't belong and then you don't continue with the training, right? And this is what's happening a lot with women that has been discussed in some research. So I think that really did sort of fuel me in a way and motivate me to try to understand like what is going on here and is there other ways that we can come about this, because I'm feeling the passion from a lot of women I'm speaking to, but I'm also noticing that we're all having a sense of not quite knowing how to be with it. And maybe that's also to do with the sort of the macho element, the colonial element of it actually fundamentally makes me a bit uncomfortable, both on an embodied and, intellectual level and culturally.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Simone. Really interesting to hear that. I mean, just following on from that, I know you've been deeply committed to feminist methodologies for performance making and for mountain engagement. I just wonder whether you could say a little bit more about that kind of methodological underpinning and how it's affected your practice.
Yeah, I think, the conversations that I had with those 50 or 60 women really was the beginning in a way. Not the beginning, because I think the Pennine Way project started some of these things, but, interdisciplinary practices, talking to all these women, thinking about what they have to say, listening practices. Pauline Oliveros, the sound artist, has a practice of deep listening, and I think that's often discussed and talked about in terms of feminist practices. It's like not just how do we listen to a place, how do we listen to one another, and how do we think and discuss and consider all the different perspectives. So in my PhD thesis I sort of talked a lot about kind of kaleidoscopic perspectives or kaleidoscopic thinking as a way of trying to articulate this thing of holding all these varying and multiple ways of seeing and perceiving and considering place from all these different elements or engagements that I'd had with people and the place itself. So in terms of that, trying to develop feminist approaches that is really about which where Nan's work comes in beautifully is, you know, in the first instance of like, how do we engage with mountains? How do we soften an approach that's not summit centric? We're not always aiming to get to the top. And I know that that exists in mountaineering culture anyway. You know, everyone knows that if you're a good mountaineer, you are happy to bail on a climb or a mountain because you're making really good choices, and it's not, you know, but accidents do happen when you don't listen to those instincts, or, you know, and accidents happen without that either. But it was really about trying to close in on some of those aspects of feminist methodologies, where bringing multiple voices in, thinking about the complexity of things and the interrelationships of multiple questions, rather than just trying to simplify it, and actually staying with the messiness of it and trying to just relax into the complexity of that. But ultimately the project really also framed it as women's experiences as well, and in order to have a bit of a focus on that too, because it felt to me like it wasn't really happening specifically in the mountaineering culture, but in the arts as well.
Thanks, Simone. I had the pleasure, obviously, of being quite close to that PhD thesis for many years, and I just wanted you to elaborate a little on a really bold move that you made in the light of that kaleidoscopic vision that you've talked about, which was not just to talk about including other voices in the thesis, but actually to include those other voices in your thesis in those sections that you had called aimings off, that navigational term. What was that about, and what did you want to achieve with the aimings off?
The aimings off came about because I guess the whole practice research based thesis and research, and then it came to writing about it, and it felt very singular and very kind of singular author driven. You know, I'm the main researcher, but so much within the practice research relied upon these collaborative interrelationships and different forms of knowledge being woven into the project to make the project itself. It's kind of like the fundamental aspects of the practice research, a bit like walking art. The walking is a fundamental driver to the sort of aesthetic practice. And so it just felt wrong to not include the voices in a way. So I came up with this conceit, and partly inspired by some of your writing as well, Jonathan, thinking about different ways to write and structure essays. And I know that you used hand railing as a construct to reflect in some of your work as well. So the aimings off was really, I guess, looking at that navigational tool or navigational approach where you think about the focus of your aiming. You're not focusing towards the place that you're, you know, a target towards. So if you're heading towards the gate, there's not this linear line that you're heading towards. And instead it allows you to intentionally set your compass to the side, and you might meet it from the side and then walk left or right to get to the gate. So it really was this kind of using the navigational term as a way of thinking of looking a little bit to the side of the problem or the side of the question. And that also relates in an embodied way to some of my movement practice as well. So I'm a Feldenkrais practitioner, which is a movement awareness practice. You know, in that approach, you wouldn't directly go to the point of pain, or you wouldn't directly go to the place where the problem is, if you want to call it a problem. You would work from the outside and you would work towards the side of it. Actually, that would be the last place you might go to, and you work around it, and it allows you to kind of have a different perspective and not always just get hyper focused on the problem itself. So it kind of had that relationship to me to also these sort of ways we might approach embodied movement work as well. But it also meant that I felt like it addressed a way of bringing other voices in that offered another perspective that was very much not just on the periphery, but really intrinsic to the landscape of the work. So the aiming off sections within the thesis, written thesis, were basically interviews and with different collaborators along the project who I felt were quite key. So the artistic director of Scottish Sculpture Workshop, Sam Trotman, was, you know, a really key collaborator in the project, and as the main organisation producing and helping me develop the project, we already had a collaborative relationship from working many years ago on other projects. So it's, her way of seeing work as a producer was a really valuable perspective. Hannah Tulicki was the composer, and our approach to working together, but also her embodied ecological approach around voice and working with the more than human was really instrumental in how we worked together on creating that choral composition. And Margaret Kerr, who's also an eco-psychologist and walking leader who I've been in conversation and been friends with for many years, was really part of that process of development of the work. Anna Fleming, the writer who I worked with on the education project with the Cairngorm National Park, and also then her developing work as a writer outside of the project and our relationship with that education. All these kind of conversations and relationships really inform the work, but I wanted to also, as a feminist practice, highlight them through the thesis itself to make sure that the thesis was also doing the feminist practice and approach and method of how the practice was made as well.
Thank you so much. I know that your work, Simone, has been deeply influenced by your own training in what's known as body weather. I wonder if you could say how body weather has influenced you as a choreographer and what it might have given you as a particular kind of sensorial access to the mountains.
Yeah, so body weather is a dance practice that was developed by a Japanese dance artist called Min Tanaka. And he set up a farm in Japan with a studio, and a group of international artists and dancers lived on the farm for many years training with Min. And they would farm and they would dance. And I guess the idea or some of the philosophy around body weather is thinking about de-hierarchizing training and teacher, and also human to environment. So the idea is that our bodies are a constantly changing environment within this wider constantly changing environment that we are absolutely connected and part of. So there's no separation between environment and body. And so that porosity between body and place is a way trying to, I guess, push against the Cartesian model of the brain-body division and plus the world-body division. And I think, that really comes out of the 80s and the sort of environmental movement and the challenges and the questions that people were pushing against in the sort of early 80s. Body weather really somehow replicates that. As in the minutiae of the training, you spend a lot of time outdoors, you spend a lot of time moving very slowly, thinking about slowing down, working with images, working with one another, just in the same way that you would work with environment as a collaborator and a partner. So what some of my main teachers moved back to Europe from Japan, and so Frank van der Ven and Christine Coirot in France and Amsterdam. A number of those sort of first generation artists working with Min Tanaka are now back in Europe and teaching. So with Frank van der Ven and various other body weather artists, and Christine would often meet in various environments. So in the Czech Republic, in Iceland, in France, in the countryside. And a lot of them were walking in mountains and moving in mountains over extended periods. The training itself really pulls in how are we engaging with environments, and how is it engaging with us, and how is it teaching us and changing our perspectives of what we even understand to be a body or our bodies or collective. It really opened up a sort of philosophical and political approach to thinking through moving. We can start to shift our ways of how we relate to place and thinking about it in terms of an environmental movement, I suppose. That's been quite an intrinsic element of my training that I also brought into the practice when working with the dancers for Into the Mountain. So really sort of offering that as part of a choreographic method. And that involved, going out each season with the dancers so that they could engage with the Cairngorms across the year and understand how they relate to different weathers and different psychological dynamics of being in that place as well, and how that has an effect on how you improvise, how you image make, and then how you work through improvised scores in relation to the place itself. So it was fundamental in that approach.
Thank you. I wonder whether you could share some honesty with us, Simone, about the rough edges of these sorts of projects. I imagine there must have been some fairly major logistical things in respect of into the mountain, land rights, working in remote areas, working with, the public in dangerous spaces. How did you manage those, and what were the kind of truth behind the polished performance?
I don't know if it was a polished performance, Jonathan, but it was definitely an honest performance. Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of fascinating process. An element of the project I really find such a rich background in a way. We spent, I guess, a year and a half trying to negotiate permissions on various areas of the Cairngorms National Park. And for those listeners who are familiar with the Cairngorms, even the summit of the Cairngorms itself is kind of split up into numerous land ownerships, and they all have different approaches. So even just going through that process of speaking to RSPB or various other organisations, I won't necessarily mention their names. Yeah, they all have very different approaches, because they're either conservationists or private or leisure businesses. I don't know if the difference between private land ownership and national, and conservation makes any difference, but essentially we worked with Scottish National Heritage and Wildlands Retreats in the Glenfeshie area, and it was like a 5-minute conversation that was really enthusiastic, and we were given permission verbally. And having spent a year trying to negotiate with another company, if you like, it felt very different to just the sort of juxtaposition of those two different ways of working and negotiating with people, and it becomes very much a conversation in relation to one another and the expectations of how that particular part of the Cairngorms is engaged with or not engaged with. So it really was a challenge at first, but actually became relatively easy. But that was based on people's enthusiasm and trust and knowledge and an interest in the work. And often sometimes in these sort of community or socially engaged practices, you might hear people saying, like, you have to go where the love is, right? And you have to kind of, in some ways they are partly the dramaturgs of the work, because they are dictating what's possible and what's not. And that is really part of, I would argue, the choreographic process, is this dance that you have with all these bodies and people and individuals, the language that each of them uses. And so it was a real journey in like how to talk to different people and what kind of languages to speak in order for them to trust you. So it was a sort of fascinating process. And I think that really also opens up and speaks to the fabric and the cultural fabric of the Cairngorms in particular, but more generally of mountain spaces and the complexity of working in these places. And obviously funding is a huge part of that. The project was funded quite well, but I think we worked really hard to do what we did with the money that we had. In hindsight, I would be asking for a lot more, and thinking about the possibilities of what that might bring in the future. So it was a huge part of the learning, of which just always fascinates me.
Thanks. Really interesting to hear about those challenges, and actually that leads quite nicely into the final set of questions that I wanted to ask before we wrap up, which is really about the future. And just wondering whether there are other ways in which you see mountains playing a role in your future plans, as far as you're willing to talk about those. I know you don't only work on mountains, but clearly this is clearly a guiding thread in your work. But also, I suppose, wrapped up with that, what kind of future do you see for the Cairngorms, or what kind of future would you like to see? How would you like your own work to make a difference to the communities who live and work in those regions? It would be really interesting just to hear you talking about those issues a little.
So I think just to think about how mountains might play a role in my future research, I would love them to continue playing a role in my future research, because I think, not just the Cairngorms, but I've spent, the past 10 years really focusing on that and spending all my time going there. And now I'm like, maybe I could do a bit more in the west of Scotland now. But thinking about the methodology, if you like, of Nan Shepherd and an approach that I guess I'm bringing in relation to Nan Shepherd's work as well, like how does that relate to other places and other mountains? And also, how does it open up a conversation potentially internationally with other mountain contexts, particularly in conversations around Indigenous practices and how people relate to the mountains that they live in or live nearby, and what sort of cultural elements can we learn from that and support these kind of respectful conversations without sort of extracting knowledge as well. So I think during my PhD, I've also been doing a course with the University of Highlands and Islands in outdoor and adventure therapy practices. And what's been really great about that course and the teachers on there is like we've been really talking about unpacking outdoor and adventure education practices historically, but really now thinking how, of course, they've used a lot of Indigenous practices over the years without acknowledging them. And now how do we start to think about how you work with those practices of engaging and taking people out in the outdoors from that education or therapeutic perspectives that acknowledges the history and also thinks about a way forward into how we might engage and how we might teach people how to engage with mountains in that sort of renewed pedagogy, certainly within a Scottish context, and how that sort of relates to that international, more broader community. So that's where my interest really lies at the moment in terms of how I might go forward with my research, because even within dance practices, you know, there's huge developments around decolonizing dance practice as well, and it sits in the same territory. It's like our bodies have been conditioned, our culture conditions us to think about mountains in certain ways, and in a way Into the Mountain was really part of that thing of like, if I don't feel comfortable and other people around who I'm having conversations with don't feel comfortable with entering into what is essentially colonial ways of being in mountains or approaching mountains, what are the alternatives? And I guess that's what's driving those questions in more subtle ways. But it's how do we uncondition ourselves physically and mentally and pedagogically to allowing ourselves and other people to find relationships with mountains that are way more respectful or sensitive. And I already know that a lot of mountain leaders are doing this. It's not that it's not happening. Every mountain leader I know has always done that and has a deep respect for the land. So it's not, I don't also want to sort of make this broad brushstroke statement that that's not happening, because I really do think it is. But I guess on that sort of wider historical level, what remains of that and who's still attracted to that, like how can we offer alternatives? And I do obviously, for my personal interest, want to bring that sort of idea of embodiment and listening, not just within a sort of well-being social prescribing element, but you know, also in that technical pedagogy way. It's a really important aspect that never gets talked about or is acknowledged. So I'm wondering how that discussion continues both within the sort of mountaineering culture and in that technical way, but also within these sort of wider social well-being context as well. And in terms of the community with the Cairngorms, I feel like even just opening up those conversations with the Cairngorms National Park and working with them and also other artists, and it being a project that just opened up conversations, and we had symposiums and other elements of the programme, just kept opening up the conversation. And, you know, that project was in 2019. I feel like there's been a huge increase in awareness around diversity and equity. And it's moving on exponentially since that project happened, which is really positive. So I have to just sort of think, oh, you know, as long as people keep opening up the conversation, maybe this project is just one of those things that instigated more of a widening of that kaleidoscopic perception of what we can do. And working with Mountaineering Scotland, I think offering these artistic approaches somehow just allow people to go, oh, yeah, OK, you can do it that way. And it might be still quite subtle, and it's not in that sort of corporate, you know, way of working, and it might not get seen by everybody. But I do think just subtly these things happen. I can't say that my work is going to change the world for the community of the Cairngorms, but I feel like there's a lot of people there now doing, there's other dancers there I know of working and doing summer camps and, you know, working with this conservation projects and stuff. So there, it is moving. there is different ways of coming into this, and I think people are starting to think about that cross-sectoral collaborative approach as a valuable one.
Thanks, Simone. That's a great way to wrap up, with just that glimpse of some of the future possibilities and future challenges as well, as you say. We're going to have to leave it there for today. Reluctantly, there's so much more we could talk about here. If you're interested in exploring Simone's work more, the project website intothemountain.co.uk is a really great place to start. Thank you, Simone, for being on the podcast today. It's been really great to talk to you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks also to Sophia Gertin for editing. And thank you to you, our listeners, for joining us. We've got more episodes coming up over the coming weeks. We're going to be exploring a whole range of new perspectives on mountain history, mountain experience. So please keep tuning in. If you'd like to support the project, please do share our podcast with others. Follow us on social media. Just search for Mountain Stories or Mountain Stories, Mountain Futures. Thank you for listening.